Hello, yes, people. Welcome back to another episode of the Navai Shift. This is a show where we sit down with founders who are solving the real battles and bottlenecks behind modern AI adoption. Now, today I got my co-host Darnell, and today we're joined by Shahab. He's the founder and CEO of Concordant, which is a platform built to solve one of the biggest challenges in AI right now. So, Shahab, how are you? You well?
I'm very well, and thank you for having me today.
No, it's a pleasure to have you here. So, you're solving one of the biggest challenges in AI right now. You've got to spill the beans. What is it?
Yeah, I'm trying to do it with a smile. um, I mean, it's basically unstructured data. That's what that is. The big challenge that, and to really understand it, I guess, comprehend it, it's good to start from the basic structure of how AI feeds on the data. So a typical large language model like a GPT or a Claude, they usually take in a lot of information, and that's how they end up producing information when you ask for it. Imagine having a big, massive library behind your monitor, and you may be typing or interacting with the LLM. And the LLM basically has the capability to pull information, relevant information, and be able to answer that question. That's essentially what that is. But the building block is the data, the vast, vast amount of data that LLM is able to consume. That's the innovation, really, is that it's large. It's called large because it's able to actually consume a lot of the data. The challenge that unstructured data presents is that it is about 90% of all enterprise data. So when I say unstructured data, what I'm referring to is information that isn't organized in rows and tables. So typically when you look at information that's on an Excel sheet or in a it's very easy for a machine to go through and recognize, here's the number, the street number, the address, here's the city, here's the zip code, here's the country, whatever, right? Because all of it is laid neatly and you can pick up that information. You can reliably say, yes, this is what that information is about. What happens is things like emails, things like PDFs, engineering diagrams, call transcripts, or chat logs. Those are things, CAD files, images, screenshots, videos. Those are images. That's data that is not very neatly and tidily put in rows and columns for a large language model to consume. On top of that, one of the things that large language model does is it actually it makes multiple passes before it starts to tokenize and ends up tokenizing the information. What that does is for access to this information, you're using a lot of APIs for LLMs to be able to consume this data and tokenize it. And that's where it does much better with clean, formatted, consistent input, right? Unstructured data is anything but that. So most companies are now recognizing that AI can accelerate efficiency, it can accelerate insight and automation, but majority still struggle to organize and structure and secure their data in a way that large language models can actually use. So that's essentially the challenge, is how do we get all this unstructured data, which is 90% of enterprise data, useful for LLMs to be able to consume and actually produce efficient insight and automation, even in terms of training agents, for example. So that's the challenge that we're wrestling with.
Shahab, that's amazing. I had like three questions for you, but you most certainly answered every single three. And what a epic intro. So that's absolutely incredible. You've built, systems in multiple environments effectively, small teams, enterprise settings, offshore teams as well, fair to say?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
So Concordant actually is built on that. Yeah.
yeah, impressive. So where do you see like the biggest disconnect between leaders that think their data looks good versus what it actually is?
I think the biggest disconnect typically is that when we think of an enterprise or a big company, what comes to mind is something that is very regimented and top-down structure, hierarchical structure. Nothing goes out of line. That's not true. enterprises have a lot of challenges that they deal with because, challenges don't come regimented. They come at you every which way. And so when you're solving those challenges, you're solving them in isolation. Let's say if a company has a problem with doc management or the invoice management, they'll grab a solution off the shelf and solve that problem. Well, in solving that problem, what they have done is they've also taken on the liability that comes on with creating that solution for that particular problem, because now they have to maintain it. Now they have to make sure that it's integrated with all the other systems that they have. That's kind of how organically the enterprise grows. So the challenge is you have all this sprawl, right, for data, which is across Box, SharePoint, Dropbox, OneDrive, and NAS systems, all kinds of different silos. You have data that's scattered across all of this. You have very inconsistent or non-existent taxonomy. So you have no consistent way of one department using one format of file name, for example, every department storing them differently, perhaps. Permissions is a huge issue, right? If you have one system that allows, let's say, Dell to access a file in that system, the same file in another system may not have same permissions. So you have this disconnect there. So I think the biggest disconnect leadership has in enterprise is they go in or they dive into AI thinking that we're going to start extracting value very, very quickly. And they discover, to their dismay, that in fact there's a lot of pre-work that they end up having to do to really get to that point. So that's the disconnect. And they discover that disconnect very quickly into the cycle. When they go into these AI projects or deployments, they discover it very, very quickly that yes, our data or our systems are not entirely ready and perhaps need a little more prep work. So that's the disconnect I'm seeing when I'm talking to customers.
So, Shahab, would you say that most kind of companies, especially enterprise level, they kind of overestimate how prepared they are for AI? Would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think they do overestimate, and we're all optimists. I mean, it's a little bit of that optimism cycle where people they go in with their eyes open. They've had battle scars from previous situations, so they do go in with their eyes open. But there's a little bit of sense of optimism when you have this grand new solution that is just exploding across industries, and really promising a great deal of solutioning for the industry when it comes to information. So there is a little bit of that optimism that pulls you in. On top of that, there's also, the fear of missing out element, which comes in with the intense amount of competition that obviously has been part of the industry for as long as the industry has been around. Which means that if I'm the CIO, CTO, CSO, or a CDO at some company, I am constantly worried about, whether I am on that edge where my competitors may be lined up, where I am actually able to get to that innovation edge or not, where I'm able to serve that innovation edge to my users that give them the leg up when they go competing against other competitors. And that's where really the bill is. That's kind of where I think the challenge lies. So yeah, that's it. I don't know if I answered the question correctly or if I answered it.
Don't worry, you did. I even have like a follow-up question off the back of that. So I'm guessing obviously you've worked in a multitude of companies. So how would you define being AI ready and having like AI ready data?
Well, being AI ready means awareness of your systems. So again, imagine companies that are massive companies. They have a massive amount of data. We're talking about petabytes and petabytes of data that's scattered all over. I have talked to customers that had data that was still being consumed from the companies that were maybe, they've been around since 50s and 60s, and they were literally, I mean, I'm talking 1950s, 60s, that they were literally taking down information, filling them out by hand, and they still had those copies. They hadn't consumed them digitally. So this is Again, and these are leading companies. I've talked to companies where that's literally the situation. It took a massive effort for them to come from that point of paper records to then digitize them and be able to then take them into their information silos. So, I think that's kind of how I see it, is that there's a great deal of effort that's still required for enterprises to actually start taking advantage of the AI promise. I think AI essentially started with a B2C setup. One fine morning you woke up in November 2022, or you saw this flash across saying, "Hey, try ChatGPT," and you did, and people fell in love. They were like, "Okay, I'm getting answers. I'm not getting links to click on to go discover on my own and do all the work. I'm actually getting answers." So, it was a lot more B2C. It's still a lot more B2C for a lot of cases, and so enterprises, I think, will have to ensure that their sprawl is somewhat under control. Their permissions and inheritance rules are in place. Governance is going to be a big part of this. Security, guardrails that you imagine, HR VP who has access to, let's say, your payroll information or your medical information, collaborating with a finance or an engineering VP. Would you want the same access to same files, to the same, these same people? Not really. You need governance guardrails in the middle. But the same HR VP may be able to, or the engineering VP may be able to type in a question and get answers based on what LLM learned in files that shouldn't be accessed to that VP. Right? And that's a breach, because now he or she may be getting answers that he or she may not have access to or should not have access to. And those are the kinds of things that enterprises are continuously now thinking about after the first foray into the AI deployment rush, I call it.
Nice. So Shahab, you're working across many fields, but what happens when a company plugs raw data into the model? What does that do?
Yeah. Well, so let's say I'm sure you've heard a lot about compute. I'm sure you've heard a lot about how expensive it can be, right? I mean, we're talking about, I think I was reading somewhere about OpenAI talking about spending so much money on some of this that they're now looking at almost government backing for some of this, because no one can do it outside of government. That's the scale we're looking at. So I think what we need to do is really understand, when LLMs go out to consume data that's plugged into the LLM, again, it's no different from the way we learn. We do multiple passes. When you read a book, you may not get the book in the first go. You may need a couple of passes. You may need to sit back and process the information with what you know already and really make the connections and figure out, how it works. LLMs learning the same way means that they take multiple passes. When they get information that's disorganized, that's not properly formatted, for example, there's a lot of compute that then goes into the consumption of that. So imagine bringing that compute down, bringing that efficiency level into the picture, where the LLM actually is able to have LLM-ready data. You have consistent metadata, that's important. You have lineage tracking, where's the data coming from, who's touched it, who's moved it, who's added to it, those kinds of things. Permission awareness, as I mentioned. All of this, if you're taking all of this and taking it out and saying, okay, here's raw data, go deal with it. Imagine the workload for data that doesn't have all this compared to data that has coherent, classification, version aware document structures. You have, as I said, permission aware indexing, metadata, all that. So it's like reading an organized book as opposed to reading something that's jumbled up, and you have to make sense out of it. That's the
Shahab, I'm going to use a little bit of London slang, but you are giving us the real spill. This is not information you can find on like Instagram and from these TikTok guys that talk about artificial intelligence. Like, this is authentic AI. So yeah, you're just delivering a lot of gold. A question that comes to mind: when you meet teams that are excited about AI, where does the reality tend to hit for them first? Is it like, their data quality, their internal processes, or is it like is it difficulties integrating everything into a consistent system?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so first challenge that we came across working with our design partners when we were launching Concordant was just good old fragmentation. I mean, now in the US market, at least, every enterprise is having to work with 150 to 200, maybe even more SaaS providers. These are your Confluences, your Workdays, your Dropboxes, your OneDrives. These are all tools that have been acquired by the enterprise over time to solve different problems that enterprise usually encounters. And that's kind of where we focused in the beginning, was how do we take care of this fragmentation? Because what typically people started doing in the beginning was, oh, you have 6 or 8 or 10 or different silos, right? And data is all in all these different silos. Let's bring it all together. Let's consolidate. And consolidate, I can tell you, there's a four-letter word equivalent to that in the enterprise, which is well known. So consolidation is unfortunately not the answer. So the question then becomes, how do we get all this data, keep it in silos that it's in, but actually have it become more efficient, have it plugged into your choice of LLM or SLM in this case, which I think is an interesting thing that people don't talk about as much, which is that you actually have different language models. You actually have small language models and medium-sized language models and large language models, and people don't distinguish as much between them, but in fact there is a good deal of difference. So fragmentation was the first thing that people we discovered in working with customers who were trying to do AI deployments. The second thing that hits them hard usually is, again, how disorganized the data is. I worked for Box for 5.5 years, and we used to have a lot of customers that did what we called, the term was dump and run. But basically just, dump whatever data you have and you never ever touch it again. Don't bother with it again. If you know that you're only going to do dump and run, you're not going to bother to add meaningful metadata or add some clean permission-aware indexing or add some coherent classification. You're not going to bother to do that. You're just going to dump and run, which is literally how the silos were treated by users. And no blame to the users. I mean, enterprise users have very busy lives. They have missions to accomplish. They have goals to take care of. They can't be charged with necessarily keeping clean data or clean room, if you will, if it doesn't impact their goal, right? So that was the challenge where people started to pull back a little bit. At least our design partners that we were working with initially, they pulled back and said, okay, let's solve these problems first. Let's solve these gaps first, and then go forward from there. So there were two things that came out of it. One were enterprises that wanted to do something about it themselves inside their own environments. Second were enterprises that said, okay, we don't want to deal with this. This is too much. We're just going to let the vendors deal with it, right? So if I have Microsoft in my environment, I'm going to just pay for Copilot, right? And let Microsoft deal with whatever data they have in OneDrive and figure it out for me. If I have let's say, Dropbox or S3, data on S3, I will let Dropbox or Amazon deal with that situation. I'm not going to bother with it. I've already got my data on the cloud. I don't care. I just want to make sure that it's secure, it's safe. These guys are offering me that, and they're offering their AI solutions. But the challenge is twofold there. One, I'd end up paying for multiple vendors for AI in different places that my data exists. So I may be paying $30, $35 per seat per month for Copilot access. I may be paying the same amount to Google for Gemini access. Now I'm suddenly making payments to all these different vendors that I'm already paying for holding my data to now make it more useful for me and provide AI facilities. On top of that, what I'm doing is I'm giving up some amount of control because that data, and I'll give you, well, actually, instead of giving you an example, not all vendors that are out there have their own engines, artificial intelligence engines. They outsource that to Anthropic or to OpenAI. Copilot is one example. Copilot had an agreement with OpenAI, right? That was their AI investment, and then they've now recently switched to Grok and others. But Microsoft didn't have their own internal model or setup to process their data. They gave that data to OpenAI to do that and have that LLM consume it and then provide answers. That's literally how it worked. So now enterprises that work with Microsoft are giving up their data and control to a third party, which is OpenAI. And yes, there are agreements in place between Microsoft and OpenAI, but you've also seen some wrestling go on between vendors. That happened as recently. It's still continuing, that whole thing. So the question then becomes, how reliable is it for me, security-wise and access-wise, to rely on the second and third parties for my data? All right. It's a different level of leap from just giving up my data. Because when I'm storing data on the cloud, yes, it's a little leap of faith that I'm taking that my data will be secure and all that. But there's processes for that. I have direct agreements with those cloud vendors, such as Microsoft and Google and stuff. But now if Google has an agreement with something else, or if Microsoft has an agreement with a third party to process the same data, I'm kind of giving up control there. And that's another challenge that they're contending with.
Wow, that's impressive. And in terms of like companies that are you selective with companies that you tend to work with?
I think typically I work with companies that have already discovered some of these challenges with deployment. Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to have to stand in front of people and try and convince them that this is it's better if they've gone through those first 2 or 3 steps and discover it on their own, realize it, and then can look for solutions that are different or better and can offer more value. So, and we're already seeing that. I mean, we're already seeing with our design partners and our customers, we're beginning to see that people are realizing it, and we don't have to really justify when we go talk to them that they should have their own setup for their own data. You know, interestingly enough, I was reading a quote, and I'm going to struggle with the person whose quote I'm talking to. This was the former OpenAI co-founder, and I'm forgetting his name now, but he said that it's unfortunate that we only have one internet. What he meant by that is that they've consumed all the data there is on the internet. And they're hungry for more data. And that's why these companies are now shifting or looking at enterprises to see if there's data mining that be done there. And there is. There's a lot of data that's sitting out there in enterprises. So that's kind of how I see the shift happening.
Oh, nice.
So would you say the sentiment is changing? Because obviously, initially, people might just kind of take the risk and not value control in a sense. But ever since, when you kind of market yourself, you don't need to kind of convince people now they want to come to you. Is that happening more now? Or would you just say it's kind of as and when they come, really?
Well, it was slow in the beginning, but it's happening more and more now. So more and more people want to talk about, hey, we tried this. How can we do this better? Or we tried this with a small segment of the data. Now we want to go big and do more data, but we don't really have that scale up strategy for what we tried in the pilot. So that's kind of, I'm seeing a lot of that where people are looking to graduate to a different level of data processing in terms of the amount of data, but there's some nervousness about, obviously, hey, we did this with 100 terabytes, but will this work with a petabyte? Will this work with 10 petabytes? That's kind of the challenge. And then how much will it cost, right? So you have these very expensive setups in data centers of GPUs that are processing all this, that are hosting all these, and companies are paying a pretty penny for getting small amounts of data to be AI ready. But I think, that's kind of where the challenge is. Once you do it for 10 terabytes, 100 terabytes, or for 500 terabytes, how do you scale it up from there? And so people are now starting to get into that a little bit too.
Oh, nice. Well said. And do you find companies more held back by, artificial intelligence models themselves, or by the lack of, how can I say it, systems, governance, and workflows around those models?
I think it's more systems than anything else. Models are in a pretty good state, in my opinion. I don't know if you guys saw the Gemini model that was released recently, but it's really now getting to a point where it's not a religious question anymore. I could be an OpenAI guy. Darnell could be a Claude person. You could have a Gemini bias. But now what's happening is that models are getting better at different things. So you might be better off in a situation using Gemini for, let's say, video, which it clearly has, in my opinion at least, an advantage in compared to an OpenAI. Or you could have different workflows utilizing different models at this point. But the models have really become a lot better in just a matter of months and weeks. Because I remember, we're now closing 2025. In the beginning of 2025, there were things that I could stump a model. I could stump a model. I could ask it questions after question. I could get it to hallucinate a little bit. But now I can see that it's becoming a lot better. And that improvement has happened much faster than I thought it would. So that's definitely the limiting factor is not the model, in my opinion. I think it's now the systems, as I mentioned, the data readiness, data governance. Those are the limiting models for enterprises.
I'm with you. So when companies get these insights from you, what would you say holds them back from taking action?
Well, so last year, one of the things I noticed was that pretty much every organization and company that I talked to had some amount of slush fund, if you want to call it that. That would just basically be money that could be thrown at AI. Anything that walked through the door with an AI tag, people were ready to throw money at it. I think that scenario is changing just a tad, where people are seeing under more real industry scenarios and applying more industry scenarios. You have hardware companies that are now actually sort of beginning to take a look at their, not just the pretty data, but things like engineering test logs, reports for failure patterns, things that they thought were going to be the next step from just figuring out your invoices and POs or your customer-facing data. Now you're looking at machine data and making sense out of that, which is a lot of data. I'm seeing more shift towards more complex workflows, more complex tasks that enterprises now are looking to accomplish. And if companies that are walking into the door with an AI tag are not addressing that, it gets cold pretty quick.
Oh, nice. That's nice. So in terms of like looking ahead, I don't want to say 3 to 5 years because that's quite extensive, but this year's gone pretty rapid. But I'll say next 12 months or 2026. What's the plans like? What's some of the goals? Is it,
Well, yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt there. But you've touched on something that I always tell. My wife and I talked about this just recently. We were talking about it, watching a YouTube video, and somebody trying to predict what is going to happen. It's kind of hard to do that, but I'll tell you, I'll make an attempt. I generally feel, talking to customers, that the areas that I see a lot of progress in the next year is self-maintaining systems. These systems that can repair their own data. They can resolve their conflicting classifications without your interference. They can reorganize content constantly, right? And continuously. So self-maintaining systems is, I think, something that I see coming. in 2026 and beyond. And I hate to put a timeline to it, but frankly, it could happen very, very quickly, because I thought it would take longer than it has for some of the things to come up that have already come up. So I'm a little nervous giving a timeline here, but self-maintaining systems, yes, that's for sure. You have autonomous RAG systems now, and RAG is basically a retrieval augmented generation, which is a little bit of a makeup of data, or dollying up of data, that allows enterprises to get better access and better insights from raw data. That there are now autonomous RAG systems. It used to be literally companies were built on providing RAG services to enterprises, and now that's become autonomous, which I think is an early sign of this shift towards self-maintaining systems. I think there'll be architectures that reorganize content into much more modern, much more usable structure. That's going to happen. I believe for enterprises, that's something that's going to be high value. All the other elements of data maintenance and management, I expect them to get automated, and I expect agents to take action on things like compliance, for example, or the autonomous data pipelines, for example. How do you structure it without humans? I think those are things that will definitely. So a lot of this boring stuff that people used to have to do with their data management, with their data silos, I expect that to become a lot more automated and self-aware, self-maintained.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. I definitely, this conversation has been so educational. Like, I'm pretty confident I'm going to watch this back a few times, because there's been so many golden nuggets that you've delivered. For the people that want to find out more information about Concordant, where can we direct them to go?
Well, the website is The Concordant, so it's www.theconcordant, Concordant.io. Basically made sure that we don't take the AI tag with us, that we basically stay focused on what we think is the underlying challenge, which in my opinion is a bigger challenge. The companies that are creating these wonderful models, they'll continue to do that. The underlying challenge for enterprises that we're looking to solve is data related and data managed. And that's kind of what we wanted to focus on. So IO fit us better than an AI.
Separating the wolves from the sheep. I totally understand. That's absolutely incredible. Well, Shahab, I was going to say thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. We're most certainly going to link the website below so people can reach out. And yeah, thank you again so much. And guys, that's been another episode of the Nabai Shift. Shahab, we're grateful to have you here. Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much.